Hey guys, I'm Deletha, and welcome to a brand new series called Brick by Brick. Now, the focus of this series is to specifically cover the day to day life of a VC student and touch on some of the challenges and errors that students may make when it comes to approaching their study and preparing for the examinations, and also cover some of the strategies that you can use to avoid falling into these traps. Now, everything we discuss is, of course, based on my own experience as a VC student back in the day, and also based on my experience as a tutor over the last couple of years and things that I've seen students commonly do. Now, in terms of the topics that we'll be discussing in today's episode, it'll actually be a continuation of what Sachin previously spoke about in the last Learn to Learn episode, which is about spaced repetition and active recall. So, if you haven't had a chance to have a look at that first, I'd recommend pausing, taking a look at that video, and then coming back to this so that the things that we'll discuss later will make a lot more sense. So, without further ado, let's get into it.
All right, Dalitha. So before you found a system, how are you actually studying? What I mean by this is, what did revision look like for you?
So yeah, great question. And this is something that many students often ask me, and something that I struggled a lot very early on in my high school journey. I'd say probably in year 9, year 10. Now, if we talk about this in two domains, the first being how I studied, and the second being how I actually revised. In terms of my study specifically, it was very rudimentary. What I'd do, let's say in school, the teacher's teaching something, I'd be writing notes down, right? And oftentimes school was my first exposure to these topics. Like I wouldn't be working ahead or trying to work through the textbook. When the teacher taught it to me, that would be the first time I've ever heard of this new concept. So I'd be frantically writing down the things that the teacher's saying in my notebook, and that would be my studying or learning at school. And then when I got home, if I was doing any homework, I'd sort of just add to that note set that I had. And this was all purely handwritten, I should say, in year 9 and year 10. So everything was done in my exercise book. And then that was it. That was it for study, right? Just write down my notes and I'd call it a day. Now, in terms of actual revision and preparation for like tests that I had at school and end of year exams and whatnot, that also was quite ineffective if I'm reflecting on it now. My approach was essentially just to reread my notes, what I'd written and what the teacher had taught, reread them again, over and over again until I'm like, okay, cool, I'm happy with this now. Um, and sometimes, which honestly, thinking back on it now, was a huge waste of time. Sometimes I'd even just rewrite my notes, right? So I've written my notes, and then I'd get a blank piece of paper and write down exactly what I had written before, basically word for word on a new sheet of paper. And once I'd done that, I somehow felt really confident. I'm like, okay, cool. I'm ready to go to my exam, ready to do my test in class, whatever it was. But then turns out, hey, I show up on the day and there were certain questions that I sort of felt out of depth with, right? I thought I knew everything. I thought I was ready, but I'd show up and the question just threw me off. So clearly that initial approach that I was using before I had a clear system wasn't the greatest way to approach studying.
Right. Okay. So Dalitha, would you say that this strategy you talked about, where you were transcribing notes and then rereading them before exams, would you say that this was something that ever worked for you?
Mm. Honestly, I'd say yes and no. Now, the reason I say that is in year 9 and 10, I thought this was a great approach, right? I thought this is the way things are done. I felt like I was studying a lot because I was putting a lot of work and a lot of time, a lot of effort into it. So I felt like, okay, I'm a good student. I'm doing all these things. That's a good sign. And to be honest, my scores on the tests that I was doing, it wasn't terrible, right? But as I moved from year 10 into year 11, so from sort of high school into actual VCE, I realized that this approach just wouldn't cut it as the scope of things became much larger, the complexity of topics increased, and overall just the volume that you have to learn in a 1-2 subject or a 3-4 subject compared to year 9 or 10, there's a significant increase. So I knew things had to change, and that's what really prompted me to have a really deep review of my approaches at the end of year 10 and to actually optimize things before I started VC so I was ready to hit the ground running.
So has there ever been a specific moment where you studied something, maybe felt confident and then blanked completely when it mattered the most?
100%. It's been something that I've experienced many, many times, year 9 and year 10 especially, and even unfortunately sometimes in year 11 as well. Now, the common reason why I was facing this issue, and also why a lot of my own students over the years have run into this issue, is due to the fact that their revision is all structured around reviewing content while having the answer in front of them, right? So if I think about my own revision approaches in year 10, preparing for, let's say, the end of year science exam, I'd be reviewing my content on biology while looking at my biology notes, right? So I would be reading through it and I'd be like, oh, yeah, cool. I know all these things. Yes, yes, yes. I know these words. I know these terms. I know these definitions. And then when it comes to exam time, I go in there and that one sentence, that one keyword, that one definition, or if it's maths or physics, that one formula, I just can't think of it. Just it's not coming to me, right? I know that there is something, but I just can't extract that knowledge out of wherever it's stored in my head. And ultimately, like I said, the reason for that is because I and many of my students that I see are studying with the answer in front of them. So what's the solution to this problem? The solution is that you have to study without knowing the answer, and the whole thing that you're practicing is trying to retrieve that answer from your brain and strengthening that connection over time. So if you think about this whole concept of practicing retrieving that information, the example that I commonly use in class when I'm teaching my students is to liken studying to sport. So let's take tennis as an example. A tennis player would spend years and years and years of their life mastering their forehand or their backhand, right? So they'd spend that time mastering that motion of hitting a forehand, getting their technique right, and executing that shot perfectly. The first time they execute a forehand is not on game day. It's in the time before that. Now, this is exactly the same thing that you'd be doing when you're practicing that retrieval, right? You want to master that motion or the specific neural pathway leading to that information in your brain. And you want to do that continuously so that each time you do it, it becomes easier and easier and easier to the point that it's second nature, right? So if you think about your teachers at school, when they're teaching a certain concept to you, they've taught it so many times before. They don't have to sit there and think, oh, what's the definition of this or what's the formula, all those things. They already know that. And the reason they know it is because they've continuously had to retrieve that information over and over again. So studying with the answers in front of you doesn't aid in that process. You have to get rid of the answer and retrieve that information yourself.
Right, so this concept of retrieval keeps on popping up. How would you say students can practice this skill?
Yeah, so with retrieval, there's a couple of different techniques and methods you can employ to actually practice it and master that retrieval of various concepts that you may have to study for. Now, me personally, what I used during year 11 mainly was applying the concept of active recall through Notion, which was a pretty rudimentary approach that I used, but hey, it got the job done. So what I did was I essentially structured all the content that I had to know for VC Bio into little Notion toggles where you'd have like a bit of content or like a question, and you'd click on the toggle and that would open up and show you the answer to that corresponding question. And the way I would study this, which was also very inefficient, is that I'd have to ask a family member or a friend to essentially test me on that whole list, right? And go through top to bottom, ask me the question, and then I would verbally explain it back to them. Now, this did of course work because I was forced to retrieve that information with no other stimulus or answer in front of me. And on top of that, it also helped because I had to verbally say it, right? So that also helped out with that retention aspect of it. But in terms of the limitations of this approach, one, it required me to find someone else, which sometimes people weren't free and able to help me. So that added a bit of friction to that process. And two, there was no way of specifically jumping straight to the exact questions and concepts that I was struggling with. I would sort of go through that whole list or that whole topic or that whole area of study from start to finish every time. So there's a lot of wasted time sort of reviewing and rehashing things that I was already comfortable with, I was already confident with, and I could retrieve quickly. Whereas some of those harder topics, they were sort of glossed by just because of time constraints. So that was what I did in year 11. Now, once I went to university, I sort of reflected on the process again. And I'm like, okay, medical school is going to be pretty intense. There's going to be a lot more content to cover and a lot less time as well. So I was thinking, okay, how can this system and this approach, which did work for me in high school, be improved and optimized further to allow me to deal with that expanded scope? And that's where I decided to implement flashcards into my study workflow. So I completely scrapped the Notion toggle system, got rid of that, and I transitioned to using flashcards specifically through an app called Anki. Now, back when I was in high school, Anki wasn't actually that popular. I know some students were using it here and there, but it wasn't at the same scale as it is now. I'm sure a lot of our viewers would be familiar with Anki, even though they're in high school. But back then, that wasn't a thing. So when I got to university, that's the first time I heard of Anki and learned about this software because it's used by basically every medical student. So the solution the solution to those previous limitations that Anki gave was it removed that unnecessary time covering things that I was already confident with. So for those who aren't familiar, the way that Anki works is that you essentially rate your confidence on the different questions that you do. And if you consistently label a certain question as very easy, you start seeing that question less. And that makes sense, right? You don't want to have to retrieve something that you can retrieve very easily over and over again. You want to spend that time working out on the hard questions and the hard things for you to retrieve. And Anki optimizes the cards that you're shown to consistently show you those hard ones and to show you those easy ones at a longer interval. So that was how I practiced that retrieval aspect, and that's what I recommend to many of my students now as well to implement during VCE itself. Right? It's not something that you need specifically for med school. It was actually an app created to learn foreign languages. So you can use it for whatever you'd like, and using it for VCE is especially a good use of that software.
So, Dalitha, you mentioned that you discovered Anki during med school.
Yeah.
Was it recommended to you by someone, or did you just stumble upon it? What really happened?
Yeah, so one of my close friends actually introduced me to it. He is like an Anki god, right? So back in the day, he had his full workflow set up. He used it in VC as well, actually. I'm not sure if he did in year 11, but in year 12 he did. But yeah, in med school he was going crazy on Anki. He had all these like plugins, all these add-ons. He had it synced to his notes through these different scripts that he had created. So it was a very complex setup, and I saw that. I'm like, oh wow, this looks very advanced. And he gradually sort of taught me how to use the system, taught me some of the methods, and that's how I sort of got into the game.
So, for your first impression of Anki after, I guess, downloading it, setting it up, what were your first thoughts?
Yeah, look, I'll be honest here. When you first download Anki and set it up, it's not the prettiest sight. The software is very bare bones if you just use it stock. The UI is terrible, I won't lie. Well, it depends. It depends. If you're a UI type of person, then you're not going to be a big fan of it. And that's a common factor why lots of students turn away from it. They're like, oh no, I'll stick to something like Quizlet online, which has nice UI. It's a website you can log into, very easy to use. But the thing with Anki is that the real strength and the real power of it lives in the add-ons, right, which I sort of mentioned before. So these add-ons are all free online. People have made these add-ons to improve the experience of Anki. So you can find all these things and you install it to your Anki and you sort of mod it out, right? And you customize it the way you want. So you can restyle it, you can set the font of everything, the colors, the format of your cards, the way that they're all organized. You can modify all those things. And it's once all those other modules are brought in that the software actually starts to shine, right? So yes, you can still use it stock. There's no issues with that. It still does all the things that you would want the software to do. But if you want to have a better experience using it and feel more at peace doing your flashcards, then yeah, having those add-ons are definitely a big help. And my mate really ran me through that, how to actually import them all. He gave me a list of recommended add-ons. So that helped out a lot and made me actually enjoy using the software instead of dreading going on to a 1990s application. Whatever. I think it was the early 2000s, but yeah. So in one of the episodes that we'll be releasing on the channel shortly, I'll actually be running through exactly how to set up Anki, how to add your add-ons, where to find them, and some of the recommended ones that would be good to use. So for students wanting to get into the Anki ecosystem and making use of the software to its maximal capability, keep an eye out on the channel for that video, which will be released shortly.
So you brought up Quizlet and how the UI for Quizlet is miles ahead of the default Anki UI. Why don't you just stick with Quizlet if you did give it a go?
Yeah, look, and this is something that lots of my students say as well, because I run them all through Anki, how to use it and the tips and tricks. And some students do still opt to go with Quizlet, and that's totally fine. But ultimately, the main drawback of Quizlet is that there isn't that same level of customizability compared to Anki, and the space repetition algorithm is something that's specialized and focused on with the Anki application. That's the whole crux of the entire software. It's space repetition. So, quick review of what space repetition is and how it works in Anki. Cards that you're really good at, you see less often. Cards that you struggle with, you see more often. Now, back in the day, Quizlet didn't have this feature. It may be something that's present now, but ultimately, the customizability of Anki is far superior to Quizlet. You can tweak all the parameters exactly to your liking. How often do you want to see a card? What's the difficulty multiplier? All those different things you can customize, and I really appreciate that in whatever software that I use, which is why I opted for Anki over Quizlet.
So Dalitha, I know you didn't use Anki in high school, but in med school, what does your Anki routine actually look like week by week?
Yeah, for sure. So the main thing with Anki is really consistency, right? Keep in mind what's the ultimate goal here? It's to practice that skill of retrieval, right? And do the reps. Just like with any sport, going to the gym, running, whatever it is, you've got to be consistent with it. It's got to become a habit. So with Anki as well, it rewards the student who consistently goes on the app and does their flashcards. Now, the way that the system works is that each day you have an allocated number of cards that you have to review. So these are cards that you've done in the past, and after X amount of days, you have to see them again, right? Now, if you miss today and you don't do any flashcards, then tomorrow you've got tomorrow's reviews and also your backlog from today, right? So the more days that you miss, the more that your reviews will continue to pile up and accumulate. So that's another factor that is a source of friction for many students. They don't have that level of consistency, and then they end up having hundreds and hundreds of cards to go through, and they lose all their motivation, right? So it's something to be really intentional about when you first start. You got to ensure that you devote time to this process daily, and you never miss a day, right? Anki, it's a completely offline app, right? You don't need internet, you don't need mobile data, whatever. You can do it wherever you are. So the way that I used to ensure that I was consistent is through doing it during my daily commute, right? So I'd take the train to uni, and instead of spending that time just doom scrolling, wasting the hours, I'd just open up Anki on my phone and do my reviews, right? That meant that in that time block where usually I would be unproductive and not achieve anything, I was instead doing something productive that I can do on the go, and that meant that when I got home, I can relax and chill without feeling guilty about not having done anything.
So I know a lot of students steer away from active recall and more specifically Anki because in their own words, they have a system that works for them. What's your opinion on this?
Yeah, so look, here's the harsh reality. There are just objective truths about memory. And I know I've been harping on about this all episode long, but in such as previous Learn to Learn episode, he covered the science behind spaced repetition and active recall. But here's the crux of it. Some study methods, like active recall and spaced repetition, are simply just far more efficient than others. So why should that matter to you as a student? Well, efficiency in your study buys you back time. What does that give you? It allows you to devote that to things that you would have otherwise had to sacrifice, like doing those couple extra practice questions, before your assessment.
So for someone who hears all this and wants to actually start, what is the first step?
Yeah, look, it's probably a bit more than just one step, but yeah, if you're a student who's really connected with what we've spoken about today, and you're someone who wants to implement this as part of your study suite, step one is really to watch that Learn to Learn episode that I've been talking about so much today, so that you understand the science behind things. And then after you've done that, we'll actually be releasing a video shortly on exactly how to set Anki up, because like I said previously, there is a bit of a learning curve and things that you can do to ensure that Anki works seamlessly. So I'll be guiding you through that process. And then from there onwards, it's all about just being consistent, getting your flashcards done, and reaping the rewards. Okay, so there you have it. There's our first episode of Brick by Brick, and I hope you enjoyed it and took away something of value. So yeah, moving forward, just keep an eye out on our channel for our next episode in all of our series. And yeah, see you next time.